All right, good morning, everyone. My name's Rob Flaherty, and this is going to be a roughly 15 to 20-minute podcast video on cultural identity, specifically in global crime fiction, where we're going to be making ties to, some books that we spoke about in class, including The Roundhouse, and as well as answering some questions I was wondering about myself, and rounding it up with including, different arguments and tying things in from different sources. Some of the questions I'm going to be going over include how the novel relates to real-life examples of cultural identity and crime, and how community values are incorporated, as well as many others, including a vast amount of information from my sources. And today I'm actually here with Ryan Webster, and later on in the episode, Matthew Kuhar. All right, so starting off here, once again, I'm here with Ryan Webster. Ryan, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, Rob.
All right. So we're going to be starting off with the Roundhouse in the beginning here. So Ryan, how do you think the novel relates to real-life examples of cultural identity and crime within the Roundhouse?
All right, so just getting into it, the Roundhouse reflects real-life examples, challenges faced by Native American communities when it comes to, crimes and justice. And the novel, explores, jurisdictional complexities and mirrors, actual legal issues on reservations.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a very powerful connection. I think it's something a lot of people, definitely overlook. I mean, when you take a look at real life challenges that Native Americans face in communities, and specifically with crime and justice, I feel like it's definitely something that a lot of people overlook, and people may not even think about sometimes. What do you think we should move into next?
Or just going over something else, how do you think the author incorporates community values into the narrative?
Yeah, definitely. So, when you take a look at the Roundhouse, as a whole, and kind of how the author takes an approach at making putting his messages within the story. You just take a look at the traditions and I guess community values that are shown throughout the story, and you just take a look at it as a whole and look at the reservation. Multiple sacred spaces throughout the novel as a whole. I mean, I saw numerous forms of symbolization about, different types of traditional culture and, the legal systems that were shown within the story as well. And I feel like overall this just, reflects how many different, in real world as well, not only within the book, how many different Native American communities, are really striving within this country to, somewhat maintain their cultural identity while going through different challenges that they often, face and are going through.
Yeah, Rob, that was a pretty interesting point you made there. I didn't really see that as I read through the novel there. Just going over another question I have for you. So how do these works impact the reader's understanding of different cultures?
Yeah, no, that's definitely something important. And, just referring back to my presentation I conducted in class, there are a lot of preconceptions and different notions about, how societies and different, groups and people have these, I guess, they have a certain perspective of how assumptions is the word I'm looking for. They have preconceived assumptions about how different, societies and cultures, act in the world scale. And I really do think that how these authors write and, they, I guess, give their opinion on how, not their opinion, but their viewpoint on how these cultures act and do things, I think that really has a huge impact on readers' understanding of different cultures. Because if you just take a look at, any book or article, for example, if an author were to, I guess, per se, depict a culture as a certain way, which, let's say, negatively, this could lead to, mass assumptions worldwide of, oh, this culture does this, and this, and lead to overall negative assumptions on the world scale. So I definitely do think that the writing and works of different authors has a huge and massive impact on the reader's understanding of different cultures. And I think it's something that a lot of people definitely and often overlook.
Yeah, Rob, I really agreed with the point you made there. But just asking another question here. So how do community values are incorporated within some of the novels you've read?
Yeah. So that's a question I saw a lot of information on, when doing research, and especially, preparing my my presentation. I mean, just taking a step back here, as I mentioned earlier, taking a look at the Roundhouse, I think you can really see just how important values are as a whole, while just reading and, taking a look at the novel. Take a look at the I guess the culture and, how they identify themselves and this and that. I mean, with just how they live, everything, the sacred spaces, they have to do everything a certain way. You can tell that their community values are definitely very important to them. And I feel like within these novels, the author makes that very apparent while explaining this. And as a whole, I think they're incorporated with every word you read. I mean, you take a look at this and, they're somewhat able to not always, well, they're not always talking about it. I feel like while you're reading these stories, just the symbolism within them, you're really able to tell that these community values, in real life and within these stories are incorporated all day, every day, and, they're very important. Just adding on a bit from earlier, just to bounce off one of my ideas mentioned earlier, taking a look at some real life examples of cultural identity in the real world. You got things like national identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, and these are all real life examples that, when you take a look at the Roundhouse, and not only the Roundhouse, but many of these crime fiction novels, this is very important just to kind of explain, who people are and how and why they identify themselves. And you're not just identified by your name, where you live, you're identified by everything, every single part of you.
So building off your last question, I
Yes.
want to go more in depth about more like, the traditional gender roles and how some of these have shaped individual or like collective cultural identity, and like how more or less some of these have evolved over time to respond to maybe some social changes or stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's definitely very interesting and controversial topic. So, just starting off, a lot of people don't realize that gender roles are actually very connected with cultural identity. They do things like shape behaviors, values, and expectations, make people think a certain way. But, things have been changing. So, starting off, just a couple examples here of how things have been changing and how significant, in different cultures, these gender roles really are. In some Native American tribes, women actually held positions of leadership, which some people might think is uncommon, but it happens. And something I know from personal experience is that people of Hispanic and Latino cultures often expect girls to care for male family members, regardless of their age. So this can include things like, oh, the women are going to be the ones who cook, the women are going to be the ones who do the laundry, the ones who clean, things of that nature. Gender roles can also have a really big impact on personal and social life. I mean, just going off some very obvious things, looking at occupational and job choices. I mean, different cultures may expect men to work here and here and women to work here and here, but things are definitely changing, especially in the United States. More fields are definitely pushing and have been gaining more women, and same thing with men. Moving on to family dynamics. Different gender roles can kind of make a division in the family, with different household responsibilities and childcare. Like, even in movies, this and that, you look, oftentimes, especially within these novels, women are depicted as the ones who, maintain most of the household responsibilities with, taking care of children, cleaning the house, laundry, things of that nature, while men are often, shown as the ones and depicted as the ones who go out, work, and provide for the family. And all in all, this all kind of ties into challenging these traditional gender roles. I mean, just going to a couple stats once again here, the number of women in the workplace has, increased dramatically over the past, couple hundred years. And, that makes sense. But a lot of people don't realize is because this number was drastically down when you go back, many different years ago. And this isn't only in the United States, this is something on the world scale. But then you also got to remember in certain other countries, you also have these people and groups who still go by this. Women do this, this, and this. Men do this, this, and this, and that's how they identify them. That's how they identify themselves, not only themselves, but their culture as well. And yeah, that's just my little take on that. Good morning, everyone. Once again, I'm Rob, and I'm going to be moving into part 2 of this podcast. So originally, the plan for this part was going to be to continue the discussion, part 1, but with my other classmate, Matthew Kuhar. Due to unforeseen circumstances, he's not able to be here for the podcast, but he did leave me a couple of talking points that he did want me to include. So we're going to be moving into that portion. So once again, thank you, Matthew, for leaving me some questions here to discuss within the podcast. Starting off with this first question: how does the setting of a character often have implications on cultural identity within global crime fiction? Starting off here, something I've noted while doing research and even reading some of the stories and films and whatnot we did within class, setting actually has a lot to do when it comes to cultural identity. So take a look at any culture wherever, whether they're isolated, whether they're in the wilderness, whether they're in a densely packed environment, whether they're in a mainstream city, wherever. This can often have a lot of implications on how they identify themselves and how properly they are able to actually act as a form of their culture. If a character, let's say, is in an environment where crime is heavy, this can often lead to a misinterpretation of how their culture is. Just to give a better example, let's say a character is in a situation where they can't provide food, can't provide water, can't provide shelter. They might have to go towards crime, even if that's against the rules and regulations of their culture, but it's something they have to do to survive. Which also ties back into the preconceived notions I mentioned earlier with Ryan, and how this can often lead to people looking down on the culture, but this is something that anyone would do if put in a different circumstance. Just moving on to Matthew's second question here. His second question was, what kind of role does cultural identity play in shaping global crime fiction? And at first glance, I really didn't know the answer to this. So I took a step back, further looked into my sources, did some research online, looked back at old texts we looked during the course. We looked back at old texts that we took a look at during the course. And I feel like cultural identity kind of shows people how in every society from all different parts of the world, different societies are really unique, and they have their own sets of, whether it's values within their society, customs, courtesies, and their own personal history that really show people about, what they might think is right and wrong, or good, bad, dangerous, safe, things of that nature. And from my research, I was able to realize how not only cultural identity, but the way these cultures depict themselves, almost as if their attitude in a way, can kind of play a very important and key role in not how only cultural identity within global crime fiction is shown, but how other people interpret and see that as a whole. Just another point I wanted to get into before we move on to the next question here. How cultural identity is depicted within these stories is almost just as much important as how it's interpreted. Just for example, a culture can be on an island, isolated from every way, shape, or form of life, as I mentioned earlier. It could be in a very crowded city. It could be in a normal town. But each society has their own way of identifying themselves, and each culture within that has their own way of also identifying themselves. And where they are almost plays as much of a big as a role of how they depict themselves, if that makes sense. One last point I wanted to hit here before ending off this podcast. Thank you for listening this far, if you're still here. So for the last point I want to get into, decided to go how globalization and culture identity kind of play hand in hand within global crime fiction. So through all my research, I noticed that a lot of these authors had a common theme in showing how globalization really did play a key role in shaping culture identity within global crime fiction. I think it's definitely, from what I've seen, is becoming more and more connected day by day, and definitely most likely more than ever before. I think all different writers from different parts of the world are finding a way to express their culture and their viewpoints on different cultures through this topic as a whole, and it's kind of making a little bit of a community behind it, and with that coming a fan base. And I think it's a good thing for different authors and people to kind of mutually engage in a little bit of a cultural exchange, I would say, and kind of showing their viewpoints in different parts of the world, which can be interesting, can be beneficial. I know earlier I was really going into a lot of the negatives of it, but there are a lot of positives with this too. One day you're never able to travel somewhere, see these different cultures, learn how they identify themselves. The next best thing could be reading a book, watching a video, and seeing how these cultures really identify themselves, specifically in this context within global crime fiction. And just to hit on one more point I wanted to hit before I wrap this up, just to restate what I said earlier, ethnicity and race play a very big role in this as well, because most of the time people within the same culture are going to be the same ethnicity and race, with the U.S. being a very different variant, with the U.S. being kind of an outlier with all the different cultures we have, and everyone kind of intermingles for the most part. Can play a key role in how these cultures identify themselves and how they're depicted within these stories, because a lot of these authors are going to use the complexities between these races and ethnicities to kind of show the different interactions, and a lot of times this can lead to conflict within identifying within how these cultures identify themselves. Like, oh, I don't like this culture, we don't like that culture, we have issues with each other, and overall lead to, negative interactions between groups as a whole. So this is going to be the conclusion of my podcast. Thank you all for tuning in and listening. Special thank you to Ryan Webster and Matthew Kuhar for helping me out with this. And thank you. I hope you guys enjoyed. Have a good day. Bye.